Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Going Dotty. I'm Tracy Egan, and in today's video I want to cover off a bit of the gap that we find between science and spirituality. We use a lot of scientific language, scientific principles and scientific motifs when we're explaining the spiritual conceptual nature of our life, our world and our being. And I just want to offer this video to be able to close the gap a little bit and to be able to explain a little bit more clearly the distinction between the two fields. So let's crack into it. So within energetics and within the spiritual explanation of life, our world, when we're talking about our energy body and our energetic systems and constructs, this is to a certain extent a fairly modern take on a fairly old conversation. And when we're talking about the spiritual scene, the spiritual movement in contemporary times, we do overlay and use a lot of the language of science because we need to have concepts and ideas to be able to communicate. We need to have language, we need to have data and constructs that we can share. So rather than making up a completely separate language, to explain everything, a whole new set of words with no primary background, that doesn't really make sense. This spiritual way of looking at life, this way of explaining and understanding our being, how things feel, why things are the way that they are. If we're all living in the Western world in the modern times, and if we're all sharing, certainly in this example, the English language, we need to be able to pull from the threads of the words within the English language and the concepts that we can all generally reach because they are available in kind of common tongue to all to be able to speak about things. And this becomes a bit of a difficulty because one of the things that I found when I am talking in a certain way and manner is a lot of individuals who are very identified, they're very much aligned with scientific principles, with things being factual. They really don't there's a lot of pushback from the kind of community of science and scientism. There's a lot of pushback from that community when somebody such as myself is trying to, explain these sorts of things. When we're trying to give language and we're trying to give structure and mechanical operational units to the binary nature of our spiritual form, and we use language like your electromagnetic energy field or your torus field, or when we talk about sacred geometry, and you're told a lot, or the biofeedback that you get a lot in life and in the world is you can't talk about that, you can't say that, you can't say that like that, that doesn't make any sense. And I just want to break down that model a little bit so that we can have a little bit of open dialogue about it. The way that I would explain it is that we use a lot of the analogies, a lot of the parallels of our conceptual life and world can be found in the reality of physical existence, as science has been able to prove it. Science, as I have researched a lot, I've asked a lot of questions, I've looked into this quite a bit, and the answer that I have been able to come to is that science is about the measurement of things. Well, it would make an awful lot of sense if science is all about the definitive structure of what is and the measurement of things. It kind of makes sense that we're not able to measure life, the specificity of life at this time. Because if we're all an individual conduit for our own lives, we are the measurement unit for that. That's why spirituality, the understanding of the non-physical element of life, the experiences that we have, why we feel them the way that we do, this is why it blends into this grey area that we can't really highlight and illuminate, that we can't really talk about because it cannot be measured by science. What could equally be happening to the same proportion for two people would not necessarily be showcased in those two people the same way. We are all individual units within this world. We are all the life that we have of ourselves for ourselves to live. Therefore, we cannot apply one basic measurement unit onto everybody in the scientific model, which is why there is this gap, there's this grey area, there's this space. Science cannot articulate the experience of life. And what we find with science a lot, there's a lot of anomalies within science. It doesn't allow for the existence of consciousness. It doesn't, consciousness is a consequence of us being here, from a scientism perspective, which is just a devastating, structure. If you're living life, if you're having experiences, if you're doing things, and if the scientific model just evaporates all of that, it's not supposed to exist, it's not a factor, it's not a part of reality. So this is the kind of hurdles that we have when we're having this conversation rationally within the world. And also myself, I'm going to share at the end of this video a bit of a profile of the very specific sort of individual who really tends to try and hamper even conversation in this model. So we'll go through that. So allowing that there's going to be quite a lot of resistance within the scientific fields to this kind of information, if it's not being said in the way that an individual with a scientific mind can. And it's not even necessarily a scientific mind. A lot of the people who really, naysay this, they're not actually scientists themselves, and they're not necessarily educated beyond a university degree. And this becomes an important point, later on within the conversation. So we have to understand the context of, there's this really heavy social narrative. So much of our society, our culture, our government, our politics, our business, all of these decisions are being made off all of these scientific principles. But, we can certainly argue that the scientific principles are lacking the fundamental core values of human existence within the nature of that construct. So there's a difficulty here. These two things conflict with each other. We do want to be able to measure things. We want to be able to perceive things. We want to be able to prove theories. But if there are a certain bandwidth of theories that we can't even move into and utilize because the dogma of a scientific mentality stops that conversation, that's a real problem in the world, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to highlight in this particular video. A lot of the concepts within spirituality and spiritualism within energetics, the reason that science naysays it, or those with a scientific mind, a dogmatic scientific principle is probably what I'll refer to it as. The reason that those with a scientific dogmatic principle absolutely squash all of this is because the science can't measure it yet. The technology that's currently available within science can measure many things, but it can't measure this human measurement system. And again, that to my mind makes sense if our conscious awareness, if our lucid structure, if our psychology and the movement of our psyche is something that is so important to the measurement unit of a life stream. Well, if that isn't even being validated within the scientific dogmatic principles, of course you're not going to be able to measure it if you're not allowing for it to be there. And yet at the same time, there have been measurable units that exist outside of the scientific remit. So for example, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but kaolin photography, where you can kind of measure the electromagnetic output of the aura and things like that. Again, these little anomalies are the outliers of the scientific community. So if they can't make the connection between one and the other, they're just going to shut the whole system down. Another little element of it is, I think we can suggest that we are the most sensitive instruments in physicality. For all of the technology that exists, for all of the everything, all the telescopes and the magnetics and the microscopes and everything in between, CAT scans and all of these things, there is a living, breathing essence to all of people. We have this innate intelligence. We have this amazing internal equipment, our mind, our brain, our gut, our instinct, our feeling. Like when you actually break these elements down, there are things that, we really take for granted, a lot of these, our instinct, our intuition. But what you find when you break down intuition is that there's regularly markers. You might say initially, I knew I shouldn't have trusted that person. But if you were actually to go back in the moment and you were to break down the body language of that moment or that construct, there'll have been markers available in the moment, because wherever we go, our psyche is. So it's very difficult to mask all of ourselves completely. So certainly at my stage of development, I think that the two is a one. you can say that it's intuition and that it's instinct, but the reality is that if you're trained in a certain way, you can break down that instinct, and you can break things down to its base level principle and understand why your intuition was untuned that day. It can be something as simple as the tone of somebody's voice. It can be the way that they do something. It can be the body language that they offer and they showcase during the interaction. But when our whole biocomputer of our body only has an instinct to comprehend and integrate all of these things in one, or it just comes in as an instinct, which we might say, oh, I just intuitively felt. And how this knits in is that, science acknowledges that our brain, emits an electromagnetic energy because there's electricity within the brain. Wherever you have electricity, you have magnetism. So there's an electromagnetism that occurs within our brain. But it's so small and negligible, it doesn't count. Well, I sort of suggest that the living membrane of the presence that we are, the intelligent unit that we have the potential to be if we are living in a high quality system, that potential is so much more attuned and so much more sensitive than science can allow for, and certainly than science can measure to a certain extent. And I say this, but what we're also finding in the fields of neuroscience is that neuroscience within the last 5 to 10 years has really discovered a lot of realities of the brain, how our human system works. And the more you go into neuroscience, the more you realize that there's so much that science itself just doesn't understand. And I suggest that if we don't have a conceptual model for a spiritual element of life, we're never going to bridge that gap. I do kind of wonder to a certain extent, like work like this, whether it's the work that I do today, whether it's work that I do in the future and other people like me do today or in the future, how this will open the minds, the hearts, the energetic centers and the spiritual centers of younger people who in the future will have the scientific training and awareness, but also the spiritual perception of being able to integrate with this language, to be able to understand these things and bring the two into a one, so that we will have a scientific evolution where science evolves its current mentality and can encapsulate the whole. Another small example is that, a lot of science might say, healing and all of this alternative angle and holistic angle is very daft. And I think to a certain extent it can be problematic if it's not dealt with correctly by the practitioner who's outlaying it, but also isn't being integrated by the patient or the person who's utilising this kind of work appropriately. So it certainly has its difficulties. But at the same time, there's a lot to be said about the placebo effect, which science doesn't understand yet. The validity of the placebo effect. This isn't a proof of anything in and of itself. I'm not here to bridge the gap between science and spirituality, just to highlight that there is a gap, but there are problems, if you're just looking at it from the dogmatic perspective of scientism, then where that is the absolute, where that is the only thing that is, there's a limitation to that. The placebo effect is an example. Also, like neuroscience is starting to be able to show and to prove that we restructure the brain with our thinking. We do change our lives and our worlds. We can heal ourselves on a neurological basis. It's an extraordinary amount of human work and effort, and it takes some semblance of a spiritual being to be able to take that on, and that's also scientifically verifiable. That would be the work of Lisa Miller, who I'll be talking through at some stage as well. But it's important to understand that there's a natural cap to the perspective of the dogmatic scientific principle, and that's what I'm highlighting in this particular video. Science itself is the measurement of things. Science is very important, and I do believe that a lot of the things that myself and other practitioners are suggesting at this time are going to be scientifically verifiable within the future, when the resources of doing that research, when the education is out there, the awareness is out there, and then the resources are being put to providing the proof or the measurement of these things comes about. A lot of people also, to a certain extent, I think you could suggest, a lot of astrologers have this living science within themselves, because they work with the patterns of the astrological chart. They see patterns again and again, and they see patterns occur within people who have similar motifs within their astrological chart. So that's not a science that astrologer can necessarily prove to the larger scientific community, but it's something that they have a living science and awareness of within themselves. It's kind of interesting. Something I came across once is that if you're getting surgery done at any stage, that you would try and get surgery done around the time of a new moon as opposed to the time of a full moon, because the moon has an effect on the gravitational force of the earth and where the water is, whether the water is pulled towards it like a bulge or whether it's pushed away during the new moon, and that this affects how much bleeding can occur during the time of the month depending on where the moon is within its cycle. That makes a lot of logical sense to me. If a full moon is going to have a high tide and big waves, and if a new moon is going to have a minimum amount of movement on the seas, well, our body has been a little microcosm of that, and if I had a choice, I would certainly prefer to have a surgery or some sort of invasive procedure that involved cutting into the body during a new moon rather than a full moon. And it's kind of amazing that this hasn't been, clocked yet within the scientific community or the medical community, that surgeries are more successful when done, in these couple of weeks rather than these couple of weeks. And I think that these are the basic things that we should soon enough be able to take steps forward into improving, to be able to encapsulate some natural element of living life with some of the basic logical common sense systems that are available through the holistic spheres and circles.